an elderly woman quietly appeared at the entrance.
She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for recognition. She came to remind him of one promise, a promise he believed had been forgotten forever.
Some promises never appear, and this one would change every life inside that church. When the celebration came to a complete standstill. And what happened next?
The largest church dedication in the nation was minutes away when an elderly woman appeared at the main gate. Helicopters circled above the cathedral, reporters crowded the entrance, and thousands waited to celebrate billionaire Gideon Fashola, whose fortune had financed the magnificent building. Giant screens displayed his portrait beneath the words, "A Legacy of Faith." The woman wore a faded brown wrapper and carried a sealed envelope against her chest. "Please tell Gideon that Miriam Bassi has come," she said. The security officers exchanged amused glances. One pointed toward the public entrance, already closed because every seat was filled. Miriam did not argue. She simply looked beyond them at the towering doors and whispered, "He promised God no forgotten person would ever be turned away." A junior usher named Malachi heard her. Before he could respond, Gideon's advisor, Silas stepped outside, recognized Miriam, and ordered security to remove her. Inside the cathedral, Gideon Fashola stood before a mirror while assistants adjusted his tailored suit. Beyond the preparation room, choirs rehearsed, dignitaries greeted cameras, and worshippers chanted his name. Silas entered moments later, locking the door behind him. Gideon noticed the tension in his face. "Is something wrong?" Silas answered too quickly. "Nothing that concerns you today." He reminded Gideon that 12 television networks were broadcasting live and that every speech had been carefully timed. Gideon nodded, yet an old uneasiness stirred within him. For several nights, he had dreamed of rain striking a rusted roof while a woman prayed beside an empty cooking pot. He had dismissed the dream as exhaustion. Now the memory returned with frightening clarity. "Did anyone come asking for me?" Gideon asked. Silas paused, then smiled. "Only admirers." Outside the locked room, Malachi watched security escort Miriam away and wondered why Silas had lied completely. Malachi followed Miriam beyond the gate, ignoring the angry glance from his supervisor. She walked slowly toward a bus stop, still holding the envelope. "Mother, please wait," he called. Miriam turned, surprised by his concern. Malachi apologized for the treatment she had received and offered to deliver her message. She studied his face before handing him the envelope. Gideon's name appeared across the front in faded blue ink. Inside, something rigid pressed against the paper. "What is this?" Malachi asked. Miriam replied, "A promise, a receipt, and the truth about where his success began." Before Malachi could question her further, Silas approached with 2 guards. He seized the envelope and accused Malachi of abandoning his post. Miriam remained calm. "You can hide paper," she told Silas, "but you cannot hide what God has appointed to speak." Silas tore the envelope once, then stopped when a photograph slipped onto the pavement. The photograph showed a younger Gideon kneeling beside Miriam inside a wooden house. His clothes were soaked, his face bruised, and both hands were lifted in prayer. On the back, one sentence had been written 24 years earlier. "When God restores me, I will build a house where the forgotten are welcomed first." Silas stared at the words, then placed the photograph inside his jacket. He ordered the guards to escort Miriam farther away and warned Malachi never to mention what he had seen. At that exact moment, thunder rolled across a cloudless sky. Every light inside the cathedral flickered. The orchestra stopped mid-note. Giant screens turned black, and the live broadcast froze across the country. Then white letters appeared above the altar. "Who did you build this for?" Gideon stepped from the preparation room, saw the message, and dropped his speech. Only one other person knew those words. 24 years earlier, Gideon had owned a failing transport company and more debt than hope. After creditors seized his vehicles, he wandered through heavy rain, ashamed to return home. Near midnight, he collapsed outside Miriam's small house. Though recently widowed and nearly penniless, she carried him inside, treated his wounds, and divided her final meal between them. Gideon confessed that he planned to end his life before morning. Miriam stayed awake beside him, reading scripture and praying until despair loosened its grip. At sunrise, she gave him her husband's savings and a grocery receipt showing everything she had sacrificed that week. Gideon wept and made a vow. If God restored him, He would build a church where widows, laborers, children, and strangers received honor before wealthy guests. Miriam answered, "The building is not the promise, the people are." Years later, Gideon remembered the cathedral, but forgot her warning completely. The cathedral remained silent after the message vanished from the screens. Technicians blamed a system failure, but Gideon knew no malfunction could explain those exact words. Pastor Nathaniel urged him to continue, reminding him that millions were watching. Gideon lifted the prepared speech, yet every sentence praising his generosity suddenly felt dishonest. From the side aisle, Malachi searched for Silas, hoping to recover the photograph before it disappeared forever. Silas had already entered a private office and locked the door. He studied the image again, recognizing the danger it carried. If the public learned Gideon's empire began with a forgotten widow's sacrifice, the entire dedication narrative would collapse. Silas placed the photograph inside a confidential file and called security. "Find the woman," he ordered. "Do not let her speak to anyone." Outside, Miriam sat alone at the bus stop, unaware that someone else had begun searching for her that afternoon. Malachi returned to his post, but guilt made every instruction difficult to obey. He watched wealthy guests receive bottled water, reserved seating, and personal escorts, while ordinary worshippers remained crowded outside beneath the afternoon sun. Miriam's words echoed within him. No forgotten person would ever be turned away. When his supervisor ordered him to block an elderly cleaner from entering the sanctuary, Malachi hesitated. The cleaner explained that he had helped construct the cathedral, but had never worshipped inside it. Malachi quietly opened the barrier and allowed him through. Silas witnessed the act from across the lobby. He approached Malachi with controlled anger and demanded his identification badge. "You were hired to protect order," Silas said. Malachi removed the badge slowly. "Then perhaps our order is the problem." Before Silas could dismiss him, Gideon appeared behind them and asked why a cathedral worker needed permission to enter God's house today. Silas quickly explained that Malachi had violated security protocol during a nationally televised event. Gideon looked from the frightened usher to the elderly cleaner standing nearby. Paint stained the man's trousers, and cement dust still marked his shoes. Gideon asked his name. "Mr. Josiah Nwafor," the cleaner replied. He had worked nights throughout construction, polishing floors before dignitaries arrived, yet nobody had offered him a seat. Gideon's expression tightened. The promise from the photograph returned with painful clarity, though he still had not seen the image. He instructed Malachi to escort Josiah into the sanctuary and find him a place near the front. Silas protested that reserved guests were already seated. Gideon answered, "Then move my chair." The surrounding staff stared in disbelief. As Malachi led Josiah forward, Gideon noticed an empty space inside his Bible where an old photograph had once been kept long ago during the grand ceremony. Across the road, Miriam declined every reporter who approached her. She had not returned to embarrass Gideon or expose his past before cameras. Her purpose was more urgent. Inside her handbag rested a medical letter she had not shown anyone. Doctors had discovered a heart condition, and surgery was scheduled within days. Miriam feared neither illness nor death, but she wanted Gideon to remember his promise while she still had strength to confront him. A young street preacher named Jeremiah Johnson noticed reporters surrounding her and guided her toward a quieter courtyard. He offered water and asked whether she needed assistance. Miriam studied his compassionate face, then handed him the medical letter. "I did not come asking for money," she said. "I came because a promise to God can become another person's shelter." Jeremiah read the letter and realized time was running out faster than anyone inside the cathedral understood. Jeremiah asked Miriam why she had waited 24 years before returning. She explained that she had followed Gideon's success from a distance, rejoicing when his businesses prospered and praying whenever pride appeared in his interviews. She never wanted repayment. However, months earlier, families from her community had sought help from Gideon's charitable office after a fire destroyed their homes. Silas's staff rejected every request because the families lacked political connections and media value. Miriam then understood the forgotten promise was harming more than her. "A cathedral can hide selfishness behind beautiful worship," she told Jeremiah. He promised to help her reach Gideon without creating spectacle. Before they could leave, security vehicles surrounded the courtyard. Silas stepped out, holding the torn envelope and wearing a polite smile. "Madam Miriam," he said, Mr. Fashola is prepared to compensate you privately. Miriam rose slowly. You still believe this is about money again? Silas opened the rear door of the vehicle and revealed a leather briefcase filled with cash. He spoke quietly, careful to keep reporters beyond hearing distance. Take this, receive treatment, and let today remain peaceful. Miriam looked at the money, then at the cathedral rising behind him. You are offering payment for a wound you still refuse to understand. Silas insisted Gideon had important responsibilities and could not be distracted by old misunderstandings. Jeremiah stepped between them. A promise made before God does not expire because success becomes inconvenient. One guard moved toward him, but Miriam raised her hand. She told Silas the families rejected after the fire were sleeping inside an abandoned school. That is why I returned. Silas's confidence faltered briefly. Then Gideon's voice sounded behind him. What families? Everyone turned immediately. Gideon stood beside Malachi, staring at the cash, Miriam, and the torn envelope in Silas's hand. Silas immediately claimed he was arranging charitable assistance, but Gideon no longer trusted the smooth explanation. He took the torn envelope and discovered the missing photograph was gone. Miriam said nothing. Her silence forced Gideon to examine every face around him. Where is the photograph? He asked. Silas replied that no photograph existed. Malachi stepped forward, despite knowing his job was already at risk. He described the image, the handwritten promise, and Silas's order to keep Miriam away. Gideon's expression changed from confusion to betrayal. He demanded access to the private office. Silas warned that leaving the ceremony would create a public scandal. Gideon answered, the scandal began when truth was treated like a threat. He turned toward Miriam, but she suddenly pressed one hand against her chest. Jeremiah caught her before she fell. The medical letter slipped from his Bible and landed clearly in full view. Gideon picked up the letter and read the diagnosis with trembling hands. Miriam needed heart surgery, yet she had traveled across town to confront him about homeless families, rather than request help for herself. Shame struck him harder than any public accusation could have done. He ordered an ambulance, but Miriam refused to leave until he heard everything. My sickness is not the emergency, she whispered. Your heart is. Jeremiah supported her while Malachi brought a chair. Reporters began gathering beyond the courtyard, sensing the ceremony had shifted outside. Gideon asked Silas whether the rejected fire victims truly existed. Silas avoided his eyes. That hesitation answered enough. Gideon instructed Malachi to retrieve every charity application connected to Miriam's community. Silas objected, claiming confidential files could not be exposed. Gideon stepped closer. Then bring me the files you buried. For the first time, Silas looked afraid of the man he served. Inside the private office, Gideon unlocked cabinets Silas had always managed alone. He found dozens of rejected applications from widows, injured workers, displaced families, and struggling church members. Many carried the same stamped explanation, insufficient public impact. Gideon read the phrase repeatedly, unable to believe compassion had been measured by publicity value. Beneath the files lay Miriam's photograph inside a folder labeled potential reputational threat. Gideon held the image against his chest as memories returned. Malachi discovered another document showing that funds intended for community relief had been redirected toward dedication advertising, luxury transportation, and celebrity honorariums. Silas entered quietly and closed the door. He admitted approving every transfer, insisting he had protected Gideon's legacy. People respect visible success, he argued. Gideon looked around at the rejected pleas surrounding them. You protected my image, he said, by destroying the promise that gave me one. Outside, the congregation waited without explanation. Silas insisted Gideon had approved the budgets, even if he never reviewed individual decisions. The truth landed painfully because Gideon could not deny it. He had surrendered compassion to administrators while enjoying applause for generosity. Blaming Silas would be easier than admitting his own neglect. Gideon placed the photograph inside his Bible and gathered the rejected applications. We returned to the sanctuary together, he said. Silas refused, warning that public confession could ruin businesses, partnerships, and political relationships. Gideon answered, then perhaps those things have owned me long enough. Meanwhile, Miriam's breathing worsened outside. Jeremiah urged her to accept medical help, but she asked for 5 more minutes. He must choose before fear advises him again. The cathedral doors opened. Gideon entered carrying the files, followed by Malachi and shaken Silas. Thousands rose, expecting the dedication speech. Instead, Gideon placed the rejected applications across the altar before everyone watching. The congregation watched in silence as Gideon spread the rejected applications across the altar. Television cameras moved closer, expecting an announcement. He lifted one file and read the name of a widow denied food assistance because her case offered insufficient public impact. Murmurs swept through the sanctuary. Gideon confessed that while people praised his generosity, suffering families had been screened according to publicity value. He did not excuse himself. I signed the budgets, I enjoyed the applause. I failed to ask who was being ignored. Pastor Nathaniel lowered his head. Several leaders exchanged uneasy glances. Silas stood near the platform, pale and motionless. Gideon turned toward the giant screens and ordered technicians to display every redirected expense. Luxury vehicles, advertising campaigns, celebrity honorariums. Each figure appeared before the nation. Then Gideon said, "This cathedral was dedicated to God, but our system was serving my reputation instead," before the watching world. The confession shattered the carefully planned celebration. Some dignitaries left quietly, unwilling to appear connected to the scandal. Others remained, stunned by Gideon's willingness to expose himself. Reporters shouted questions from the aisles, but Pastor Nathaniel asked them to wait. Gideon invited Silas to speak. For several seconds, the advisor remained frozen. Then he approached the microphone and admitted designing the charity system around media value, believing visible success would attract greater influence. I told myself the outcome justified the method, he said. But I trained this ministry to notice cameras before people. The congregation reacted with anger. A woman whose application had been rejected stood and demanded justice. Silas lowered his eyes. Gideon did not defend him. Instead, he announced an independent investigation and promised every displaced family would receive immediate shelter. Before anyone could respond, Malachi rushed toward the platform carrying news from outside. Miriam had collapsed nearby. Gideon abandoned the platform and ran through the cathedral as cameras followed. Outside, Jeremiah knelt beside Miriam while paramedics prepared a stretcher. Her pulse had weakened, and she struggled to remain conscious. Gideon dropped beside her, gripping the old photograph. "Please forgive me," he whispered. Miriam opened her eyes and answered. Forgiveness was never withheld. He began promising surgery, doctors, and any expense required, but she gently interrupted him. "Do not use money to escape repentance." Jeremiah looked directly at Gideon and urged him to listen. Miriam explained that the abandoned school sheltering fire victims had become unsafe after heavy rainfall damaged the roof. Children were still sleeping there. "Help them before another night comes," she pleaded. Gideon turned to Malachi and ordered buses, hotel rooms, food, and medical teams immediately. As paramedics lifted Miriam, thunder rolled again, and rain began falling over the city without warning that afternoon again. The storm intensified before the ambulance reached the hospital. Roads flooded, traffic stopped, and emergency crews warned that the abandoned school could collapse. Gideon cancelled every remaining dedication event and converted the cathedral into a temporary relief center. Ushers removed decorations, while volunteers arranged mattresses across the sanctuary. Kitchens prepared meals. Church buses left to collect displaced families. Jeremiah joined the rescue team, and Malachi coordinated names from the rejected applications. Silas stood alone near the entrance, watching the system he built unravel beneath genuine service. Gideon handed him a raincoat. "You wanted to protect my legacy," he said. "Help me repair the lives we neglected." Silas hesitated, then joined the volunteers. At the school, water poured through broken ceilings as frightened families gathered their belongings. A loud cracking sound echoed above them. Jeremiah looked upward and shouted for everyone to move, as part of the roof began collapsing inward. Dust and rain filled the corridor as the weakened roof crashed behind the fleeing families. Jeremiah carried a young boy, while Malachi guided an elderly woman through the doorway. Gideon and Silas pulled debris away from a trapped teacher whose leg was pinned beneath timber. Emergency workers arrived moments later, but another section of the building shifted dangerously. Gideon refused to leave until every person was accounted for. The final count revealed one child missing. Her mother screamed that 6-year-old Esther had returned upstairs to retrieve a photograph of her late father. Jeremiah immediately moved toward the staircase, but Gideon stopped him. "You have already risked enough," he said. Before anyone could argue, Gideon entered the unstable building alone. Silas stared after him, then followed. Outside, thunder shook the ground. Inside, Gideon heard a child crying somewhere beyond the darkness, while the remaining ceiling groaned above them in terrifying protest. Broken beams groaned above Gideon as he searched the upper floor through darkness and driving rain. Dust filled the air, making every breath difficult. "Esther!" he called repeatedly. A faint sob answered from behind a collapsed classroom door. Gideon forced the damaged frame open and found the frightened girl clutching a faded photograph against her chest. She refused to leave without it because it was the last picture of her father. Gideon wrapped his coat around her and carried her toward the staircase. Suddenly another support beam cracked. Before Gideon could react, Silas rushed forward and pushed them clear as heavy timber crashed where they had been standing. Pain shot through Silas's shoulder, yet he ignored it. Together they escaped seconds before the remaining ceiling collapsed completely. Outside, volunteers erupted in thankful applause, while Gideon silently realized another person had sacrificed himself to save his future once again. Miriam regained consciousness later that evening inside a quiet hospital room. Rain tapped gently against the window while machines monitored her weakening heart. Gideon entered carrying the rescued photograph Esther had protected. He placed it beside Miriam's bed before speaking. "Today I finally understood why you came." Miriam smiled faintly. "Understanding is only the beginning." Gideon confessed that success had slowly convinced him to trust systems more than compassion. He promised the rescued families would receive permanent homes rather than temporary assistance. Jeremiah entered with encouraging news that every displaced family had reached safety. Even Silas, despite his injury, remained helping volunteers distribute supplies through the night. Miriam thanked God quietly. Looking toward Gideon, she added, "A promise is fulfilled one decision at a time." Gideon nodded. For the first time in many years, he felt no desire for applause. He only desired faithfulness before God, each remaining day. Within weeks, construction began on a new community housing project, funded personally by Gideon, without publicity campaigns or dedication ceremonies. The first buildings rose beside schools, medical clinics, and playgrounds designed for families who had lost everything. Gideon insisted every financial record remain publicly available, allowing independent oversight from respected church leaders and community representatives. Malachi supervised volunteer teams, discovering gifts for leadership he never realized he possessed. Jeremiah organized Bible studies and youth mentoring programs for children affected by the fire. Silas quietly managed logistics, refusing interviews and declining every invitation to explain his transformation publicly. Reporters noticed the unusual absence of promotional banners. One journalist asked Gideon why no company logos appeared anywhere. Gideon smiled. "People once knew this work because my name stood above it. I hope they remember this one, because Christ is seen through it." Many listeners reflected deeply afterward together. Several months later, Miriam returned to the cathedral after recovering from successful heart surgery. This time, no security officer questioned her arrival. Before she reached the entrance, ushers, cleaners, musicians, and volunteers welcomed her with warm smiles. Gideon met her outside instead of waiting inside the sanctuary. He embraced her gratefully before walking beside her through the open doors. The congregation rose, not because of wealth or influence, but because they recognized faithful obedience. Gideon invited Miriam to sit in the front row, yet she quietly declined. "Place me wherever every grandmother can sit," she answered. Gideon smiled and chose the same section occupied by widows, laborers, and ordinary families. Jeremiah preached that morning from the Epistle of James, reminding everyone that genuine faith is demonstrated through mercy. The congregation listened with renewed humility, understanding those words carried living testimony before their eyes and hearts forever. After the service, Gideon gathered church leaders, volunteers, and staff for an important meeting. Instead of discussing future building projects, he presented a new ministry covenant. Every major decision would first answer one question: how does this serve the people Christ loves? Budgets would prioritize mercy before appearance, outreach before prestige, and discipleship before recognition. Pastor Nathaniel signed first, followed by Jeremiah, Malachi, Silas, and every department leader. The document was framed and placed near the cathedral entrance where every visitor could read it. Gideon looked toward Miriam, who quietly nodded with peaceful satisfaction. "The promise is finally being lived," she whispered. Yet, as everyone prepared to leave, a volunteer hurried into the room carrying an unexpected envelope addressed to Gideon. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Across the front appeared only 6 troubling words. One promise remains completely unfinished. "Come alone tonight." Gideon studied the mysterious envelope long after everyone had gone home. No return address appeared anywhere, only the instruction asking him to come alone. Jeremiah advised caution, while Malachi suggested informing the police before meeting an unknown messenger. Gideon thanked them both but believed he should first discover whether the letter connected to the forgotten promise. That evening he drove quietly to the abandoned transport depot written inside the envelope. The place had once housed the first trucks he owned before bankruptcy destroyed everything. Rainwater dripped through the rusted roof as he entered with a flashlight. A single lantern burned near the office doorway. Beside it stood an elderly man holding a worn ledger. "My name is Samuel Ekenem," he said calmly. "Your promise changed many lives, Gideon. But before Miriam found you, someone else paid a price you have never known." Gideon listened without speaking. Samuel carefully opened the weathered ledger and placed it upon the dusty desk. Every page contained names, dates, and handwritten notes describing families Miriam had quietly helped long before Gideon became wealthy. Beside several entries appeared Gideon's name followed by one sentence: "Pray for the young man God will raise." Samuel explained that Miriam never carried the burden alone. Members of a small prayer fellowship sold personal belongings, skipped meals, and contributed their savings because they believed God intended to restore Gideon for a greater purpose. None expected recognition. Most had already entered eternity. Gideon slowly turned each page, realizing his success rested upon sacrifices made by people he had never met. Tears blurred the ink. "Why tell me now?" he whispered. Samuel answered gently, "Because gratitude should never stop with the person you remember. It must reach everyone who carried the promise together before God." Before dawn, Samuel led Gideon through narrow streets to a modest prayer house, standing behind an old mission chapel. The building was simple, with cracked walls, wooden benches, and faded hymn books stacked neatly beside the entrance. Samuel explained that Miriam and several believers had gathered there every Friday night for years, praying for struggling families, missionaries, and unknown people needing God's mercy. Gideon recognized none of the names written on the attendance register except Miriam's. Yet beside every meeting appeared another request: "Pray for Gideon's future." He stared silently at decades of faithful intercession offered while he pursued wealth and recognition without ever knowing. Jeremiah and Malachi arrived after following at a respectful distance. Together they knelt inside the quiet room. Gideon whispered, "I built a cathedral before discovering the place where its foundation was truly laid." Everyone remained silent before the Lord for many grateful minutes. Later that week, Gideon invited every surviving member of the old prayer fellowship to the cathedral. They arrived quietly, expecting nothing more than an ordinary Thanksgiving service. Most wore simple clothing and seemed uncomfortable receiving attention. Gideon welcomed each one personally before leading them to the platform. The congregation looked on with curiosity. Holding the weathered ledger high, Gideon explained that these ordinary believers had invested prayers, sacrifices, and faith long before anyone celebrated his success. "You never knew their names," he said, "because they never asked to be known." One by one, he introduced them and shared brief stories from the ledger. The congregation rose in heartfelt applause, not to honor wealth but hidden faithfulness. Miriam smiled as tears filled her eyes. Jeremiah quietly read from Hebrews about those whose faithful lives pleased God, though the world rarely noticed them during their earthly journey together. After the service ended, Miriam asked Gideon to walk with her through the now peaceful cathedral courtyard. Evening sunlight reflected across the windows, while children laughed nearby. She told Gideon her strength was slowly returning, but age reminded her that every earthly assignment eventually reaches completion. "I have one final request," she said softly. Gideon immediately promised to grant it. Miriam shook her head. Do not promise until you hear it. She pointed toward the busy streets beyond the church walls. Build leaders before buildings. Teach young believers to love people before platforms. If that continues after we are gone, the promise will outlive both of us. Gideon stood quietly, absorbing every word. Jeremiah and Malachi watched from a distance, sensing the conversation marked another turning point. Gideon finally nodded. With God's help, he replied, that will become the greatest work of my remaining years. 1 year later, the cathedral looked unchanged from the outside, yet its greatest work no longer happened beneath the towering roof. Gideon transformed an unused conference wing into the school of servants, where young believers learned that leadership began with humility rather than recognition. Jeremiah became the program's first director, teaching scripture alongside practical service in hospitals, orphanages, prisons, and neglected communities. Malachi coordinated volunteers, ensuring every student spent more time serving than speaking. Gideon attended every class without announcing his arrival, often sitting among the students taking notes like everyone else. Visitors expecting leadership seminars about influence instead found people washing dishes, delivering food, repairing homes, and praying with lonely neighbors. Miriam watched quietly from the back row one afternoon. Smiling, she whispered to herself, "This is the church I prayed for before the first brick was ever laid." Her heart overflowed with quiet gratitude. Months passed, and testimonies multiplied across the city. Graduates from the School of Servants planted outreach ministries in forgotten neighborhoods, visited hospitals weekly, mentored vulnerable children, and partnered with struggling churches without seeking recognition. The cathedral became known less for its architecture than for the compassion flowing from its members. One evening, Jeremiah asked Gideon what legacy he now hoped to leave behind. Gideon smiled thoughtfully before answering, "If people remember my name, I have failed. If they remember Christ because someone loved them well, then I have succeeded." Malachi quietly recorded those words inside the ministry journal, believing future generations would need the reminder. Miriam looked toward the growing class of young servants and thanked God that the promise had moved beyond one man. It now belonged to countless believers who understood that ordinary faithfulness could change lives forever through God's sustaining grace. As the seasons changed, Miriam's health gradually weakened once more. She welcomed every visitor with the same gentle smile that had encouraged Gideon decades earlier. One afternoon, Gideon, Jeremiah, Malachi, and Silas gathered around her bedside. Miriam thanked each of them for choosing obedience over comfort. She reminded Gideon never to confuse growth with faithfulness, reminded Silas that truth always protects better than deception, encouraged Malachi to remain courageous when compassion became unpopular, and urged Jeremiah never to stop preaching Christ with humility. After praying for them individually, she rested peacefully, confident her assignment had been completed. Though tears filled the room, no despair remained, because her hope had always rested in the Lord she faithfully served. Gideon quietly held her weathered grocery receipt, realizing its greatest value had never been financial. It had become a lasting testimony of sacrificial love and unwavering trust in God's providence. Following Miriam's passing, the cathedral held a simple Thanksgiving service instead of an elaborate memorial. Gideon refused grand tributes, insisting Miriam herself would have preferred resources directed towards serving others. The congregation established the Miriam Bassi Compassion Fund, supporting widows, disaster victims, and overlooked families without publicity. Every recipient received practical help with dignity and prayer, never requiring public recognition or photographs. Jeremiah challenged the congregation from Scripture, reminding them that every generation must choose whether promises become monuments or living missions. Malachi placed Miriam's grocery receipt and Gideon's original handwritten promise inside a protective display near the School of Servants. Visitors paused before it daily, reading the story that had reshaped an entire ministry. Children often asked why an old receipt deserved such careful preservation. Volunteers always answered, because heaven measures sacrifice differently than the world. Those words inspired countless quiet acts of generosity thereafter. Years later, travelers visited the cathedral from many nations. Some admired the beautiful architecture, yet most returned home remembering something entirely different. They remembered volunteers serving without seeking applause, leaders walking beside ordinary worshippers, and a church where forgotten people found honor before influential guests. Gideon often stood quietly near the entrance greeting strangers, grateful that the promise once nearly lost had become the foundation of everything that followed. Jeremiah continued preparing new generations of servant leaders. Malachi faithfully guided ministries with wisdom and compassion. Silas spent his remaining years helping churches build transparent systems that protected both truth and mercy. The narrator spoke softly. Buildings may inspire admiration for a season, but love offered in Christ leaves an eternal inheritance. Heaven is never impressed by the size of a sanctuary. Heaven rejoices whenever a forgotten soul discovers they were never forgotten by God.